Imagine I told you that your money can double without you working twice as hard. And imagine I told you that most people completely ignore the one number that determines how fast that happens. Not because it is complicated, but because it is deceptively simple. There is one rule that quietly explains why some people build wealth almost effortlessly over decades, while others stay stuck even on strong incomes. It is called the Rule of 72. And once you truly understand it, you will never look at interest rates the same way again. Because this is not just a math shortcut, it is a lens that changes how you see time, risk, patience, and your entire financial trajectory. By the end of this video, you will not just know the rule, you will see your future differently. You will understand why small percentage differences create massive life differences, and why the real game of wealth is not income, but acceleration. The Rule of 72 is shockingly simple. You take 72 and divide it by your annual rate of return, and the result tells you approximately how many years it takes for your money to double. If you earn 8%, 72 divided by 8 equals 9 years. If you earn 12%, it doubles in 6 years. If you earn 4%, it takes 18 years. That is it. That is the entire formula. But here is the part most people miss. This rule is not interesting because it predicts doubling. It is powerful because it reveals speed. It shows you how fast your capital multiplies while you are not watching it. It reframes money from something static to something kinetic, from something you store to something that expands. And once you start thinking in doubling cycles instead of annual returns, your mindset shifts. You stop obsessing over small daily fluctuations and start focusing on long-term velocity, because the real question becomes not, how much did I make this year, but how fast is my capital compounding over decades? And that question changes everything. The first real shift happens when you realize that time is not just passing, it is multiplying. If you earn 8%, your money doubles every 9 years. If you start investing at 25, that means by the time you are 65, you could experience roughly 4 or 5 doubling cycles. 10,000 becomes 20,000, 20 becomes 40, 40 becomes 80, 80 becomes 160. And that is without increasing effort. That is the invisible multiplication effect of time. And here's the critical insight. Wealth is not built in a straight line. It is built through stacked doubling events. Each cycle builds on the previous one, and the later cycles are exponentially more powerful than the early ones, which means the earlier you start, the more cycles you unlock. And the more cycles you unlock, the more dramatic the later stages become. This is why two people earning similar incomes can end up in completely different financial positions, because one started earlier and allowed more doubling cycles to stack. The Rule of 72 exposes this invisible advantage, and once you see it, you stop underestimating the power of starting now. Because every year you delay is not just a year lost, it is a potential doubling cycle erased. But the Rule of 72 does not just work in your favor, it works against you too. And this is where it becomes sobering, because the same formula applies to debt. If you carry credit card debt at 18% interest, 72 divided by 18 equals 4, which means your debt can double every 4 years if left unmanaged. That means what feels manageable today can quietly become overwhelming tomorrow. And most people never run this calculation. They focus on minimum payments. They focus on monthly strain. But they do not see the multiplication happening underneath them. They are unknowingly compounding against themselves. And that is the silent trap. High-interest debt is not just expensive, it is exponential. The Rule of 72 forces you to see that exponential growth can either be your greatest ally or your biggest enemy, depending on direction. And once you see debt through this lens, it stops feeling like a small inconvenience and starts looking like a multiplying liability. And that awareness alone can change behavior more effectively than any budgeting trick ever could. Because now you are not fighting a bill, you are fighting acceleration. The next realization is subtle but life-changing. Small differences in return create massive differences in outcome. If one investor earns 6% and another earns 10%, that 4% gap sounds minor on paper. But 72 divided by 6 equals 12 years, while 72 divided by 10 equals roughly 7 years. That means one person doubles their money nearly twice as fast. Over decades, that speed difference compounds dramatically. And what looked like a small percentage gap becomes a huge wealth gap over time. This is why structure matters more than hustle, You can work longer hours. You can earn more income. But if your capital compounds slowly, you are running on a treadmill while someone else is riding an escalator. And this is not about chasing risky returns. It is about understanding efficiency. It is about minimizing unnecessary fees, optimizing tax exposure, maintaining disciplined allocation, and avoiding destructive behaviors. Because when your base grows, even small inefficiencies scale, and small improvements scale as well. The rule of 72 quietly teaches you that increasing your rate even slightly can compress your timeline dramatically. And compressing your timeline is often more powerful than increasing your income. The deeper shift happens at the identity level. Once you understand the rule of 72, you stop asking, how much can I earn this year? And start asking, what rate am I compounding at? You move from chasing income to engineering acceleration. You begin evaluating opportunities based on long-term return potential instead of short-term excitement. You begin thinking like an allocator of capital rather than just an earner of income. This is a profound psychological upgrade. Earners think in months. Allocators think in decades. Earners feel pressure. Allocators feel strategy. And that shift reduces anxiety because now you understand that wealth is not about dramatic leaps. It is about sustained compounding. And sustained compounding requires consistency, not intensity. It requires patience, not panic. And once you internalize that, you start to value boring investments, stable index funds, diversified portfolios, systematic contributions, because you understand that doubling cycles reward time far more than they reward hype. And this calm, structured mindset becomes your real competitive advantage. The concept of runway becomes critical here. Wealth is not about how big your income is, it is about how long your capital compounds. If you start at 25, you may have 40 years of runway. If you start at 35, you have 30 years. That missing decade is not just 10 contributions, it is potentially one entire doubling cycle erased. And losing one doubling cycle can mean the difference between financial stress and financial independence later in life. This is why early discipline is disproportionately powerful. The first few years of investing may feel slow, unimpressive, almost invisible. But they are setting up future multiplication. And most people quit during this quiet phase because they mistake slow growth for no growth. They do not realize they are building the base that future doubling cycles will multiply. The rule of 72 exposes this hidden leverage. And once you see that each early year is planting seeds for exponential later growth, you become less impatient. You become more strategic, and you begin respecting time as your most valuable asset, not because it passes, but because it multiplies. The reason this rule feels boring to many people is precisely why it is transformative. It does not promise overnight wealth. It does not guarantee quick results. It does not create excitement. And the market does not reward excitement. It rewards time. The most dramatic compounding happens at the end of the journey, not the beginning. If you start with $10,000 at 8%, it becomes $20,000 in 9 years, 40 in 18, 80 in 27, 160 in 36. The early doubling feels modest. The later doubling feels explosive. But that explosion only happens because you endured the quiet years. And this is the emotional lesson most people miss. The biggest gains often occur after years of seemingly slow progress. If you abandon the process early, you never reach the stage where growth accelerates. And this is why long-term investors often appear lucky from the outside. But from the inside, they were simply patient. They allowed doubling cycles to stack uninterrupted. And uninterrupted time is the real secret. The rule of 72 is not teaching you arithmetic. It is teaching you behavior. It is teaching you that consistency outperforms intensity, that patience outperforms panic, that structure outperforms chaos. It is teaching you that the early years are foundational and the later years are multiplicative. It is teaching you to measure progress not by yearly gains, but by completed doubling cycles. And once you adopt that lens, market downturns feel different because you are thinking in 9-year blocks, not 9-day blocks. You understand? That volatility is part of the journey, not a signal to abandon it. And that perspective stabilizes you emotionally because you are anchored in long-term math rather than short-term noise. And emotional stability in investing is often more valuable than intelligence. The final shift is about control. Once you understand how long it takes your money to double, you stop feeling behind. You stop comparing yourself impulsively. You stop chasing shortcuts. You start designing systems. You start respecting rates. You start protecting runway. You evaluate every financial decision through the lens of acceleration. Will this increase or decrease my compounding speed? Will this extend or shorten my runway? Will this protect or disrupt my doubling cycles? And when you begin thinking this way, your financial life becomes intentional rather than reactive. You move from hoping for wealth to engineering it. And engineering feels calm, it feels measured, it feels durable. The rule of 72 will not make you rich tomorrow, but it will permanently change how you interpret time, risk, return, and opportunity. Every interest rate becomes meaningful. Every debt percentage becomes urgent. Every investment decision becomes strategic. And once you see money through the lens of doubling cycles, you never go back. Because you are no longer watching money sit still, you are watching it multiply. And when multiplication becomes your frame, wealth stops feeling theoretical. It starts feeling inevitable. And that is when everything changes. Now here is an advanced layer that almost no one talks about. And it is the layer that separates understanding the rule from weaponizing it. The rule of 72 is an approximation, which means it is most accurate within moderate return ranges, typically between 6 and 12%, and that subtle fact teaches you something powerful about expectations. When people assume unrealistic returns of 20% per year, the math may still work on paper, but the risk required to sustain that level of performance changes dramatically. In other words, the rule quietly nudges you toward realism. It encourages sustainable compounding rather than speculative spikes. And this matters because sustainable compounding is repeatable. Repeatability is the foundation of wealth. If you can reliably earn 7 to 10% over decades through diversified exposure, disciplined contributions, and emotional stability, you do not need extreme outcomes. You need endurance. And endurance is built on managing risk, not maximizing excitement. The rule also reveals something fascinating about inflation. If inflation averages 3% per year, 72 divided by 3 tells you that purchasing power halves roughly every 24 years. That means if your money is sitting idle earning nothing, it is silently shrinking in real terms. You may see the same dollar figure in your account, but its buying power is being cut in half over time. That realization alone should permanently change how you think about cash. Cash is not neutral. It either compounds positively in investments, or it compounds negatively through inflation. There is no middle ground. The rule of 72 makes this invisible erosion visible. It shows you that standing still financially is actually moving backwards slowly. And when you combine this with disciplined investing, you begin to understand that your true goal is not just growth, but growth above inflation. Real returns matter more than nominal returns, because doubling in dollars means little if purchasing power is eroding just as quickly. Finally, the rule of 72 can guide life decisions beyond investing. When evaluating career paths, business opportunities, or skill development, you can think in terms of compounding rate of personal capital. What skills increase your earning power at a rate that doubles your income over a decade? What networks accelerate your opportunities? What habits compound positively over time? The rule becomes a mental shortcut for evaluating growth everywhere. You start asking, what is the doubling time of this decision? And that question filters out short-term noise. Because if something does not meaningfully improve your long-term compounding rate, it may not deserve your focus. And this is where the rule transcends finance. It becomes a philosophy of growth, slow, steady, strategic, sustainable acceleration over long periods. That is the real secret. Not hacks, not hype, not shortcuts. Just intelligent compounding applied consistently across decades. And once you adopt that philosophy, wealth stops being mysterious. It becomes mathematical, behavioral, and ultimately predictable for those patient enough to let the cycle stack.